Today is July 19th, or 20th, July 20th, 2007. I am Jessica Clark. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Bismarck, North Dakota. To start with, can you please state your name?
Matt Gross,
And where were you born, Matt?
south of Napoleon in Logan County,
Okay. And when were you born?
April the 30th, 1921.
Did you ever hear a story about your birth?
Yes,
Can you share it with us?
yeah, they didn't expect my mother to live. Yeah, I think she was in labor for 2 days, and doctors weren't too available in those days, and had a bad rain storm, and so they had midwives there, and I wasn't positioned just right. So Dad had the neighbor use our car to go to Wishick and try to get Dr. Grant. And he made it. He got the doctor, but by that time I was born. So they really didn't need the doctor, but it looked bad for quite a while.
She survived, though?
Yes. And by the way, I was the youngest of 10. See, my oldest brother was Tony. He was 17 years older than I.
Can you share one of your earliest memories with us?
Pardon, what is that?
Can you share one of your earliest memories with us?
You mean the earliest I can remember?
Mm-hmm. One of your first memories.
Well, there's very vaguely I can remember something about my sister getting married. She was second in line. Tony was the oldest, and Margaret. And she got married in 1925. See, so I was only 4 years old. And I seem to remember a little bit about seeing them sit around, and of course there was a dance too. And I think at that time the fashion was yet that the groom was supposed to be wearing a cap. I seem to remember a little bit about that. Now, but I never saw it again, or maybe he just had it on for a while too. But well, then there would be different things, I suppose, growing up on the farm that would come up. But that would be my most distant remembrance that I have.
Did you go to a lot of weddings when you were growing up?
Weddings?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no. We had to stay at home. That was just for the old people. And then some of the older boys or girls got invited, and some had to help along with, that was done on farms. And they had some lady to do the cooking, and they had girls to carry the food again, maybe from a summer kitchen to the house. And I know that's the way it was at our place. We had a summer kitchen which we used in the summertime, and that's what the cook used for a wedding. And of course that food had to be carried over to the house. Sometimes if it was nice weather, they could come around the back and have a window open and bring it in that way. And the weddings were usually at our place, because we had a larger house than most. And we had a good floor, hardwood floor in the kitchen For dancing, of course, that was necessary, to dance in those days.
So you said you had 10 children in your family?
Yes.
Can you take me from the oldest to the youngest and tell me their names?
Anton, and then Margaret, Alois, Rose, Philippine, Rachel, Elizabeth, Leo, Bertha, and then I came.
So when you were growing up, did you know Anton at all? Was he around the home or was he gone already?
Yes, I am. See, he got married in 1928. So by that time I was 7 years old.
When you think back to your childhood, what type of a brother was Anton?
He was more the outgoing type. He liked to visit. He liked to read. And Alois, he was the next oldest boy. He was more for working on the farm. That's what he liked. But Anton, in those days, the family usually provided for a farm for the sons. If they couldn't buy a place but rent a place, and then they gave them a start with horses and machinery. And of course the girls, they got their kitchen supplies and bedroom sets and so on. So, and that's how it went. None of them went to high school except me. Because, those German people, they were just good to make farmers out of them. And, but some of them would rather do more studying. See, Antoni, he was good in school for so long ago. That was all one-room schools. And I think at one time in our one-room school, I think there was 27 students and one teacher. But when I came along, then it was probably down to about 15 or 16 yet. But can you imagine trying to learn something with a group, some reciting with the teacher up front, and you were supposed to do your studying back there? Well, how could you when they were reviewing up there, and the teacher would get angry and so on, and they didn't know their lesson and take it over again and so on. And
so with Anton and, is it Elos? How do you pronounce your other brother's name?
Alois,
Elois.
he was the second oldest boy.
Were you close to them when you were growing up?
To Alois, I was the closest. He had the best disposition. I could sit on his lap. I was just a kid, growing up, and that was fine with me. But I don't remember ever sitting on Anton's lap, because he was a big boy already. You see that.
How much older than you was Elos?
Well, see, Anton was 17 years older, and Alois was born in 6 or 7. I would have it written down for sure, but
We can look it up at a minute. What about Margaret? What type of a sister was she?
I remember very little about her. The oldest picture I can remember, I was sitting on her lap, and we had a teacher at our place rooming there. Margaret Apley was her name. And they had dressed up in men's clothing, and they took a picture of that, just if they were men. And that picture's around somewhere. Maybe my sister had it yet because my dad stayed with my sister after my mother died. And my dad stayed with my sister after Ma died for about 12, 13 years. And but that's what I remember about. Well, I don't remember, but I know the picture. That's the oldest picture that I can remember.
And what about Rose? What type of a sister was she?
Well, I wouldn't know how to describe her. She was sort of easygoing. She got married in 1931, and Eloise in 1932. And then we didn't have a wedding until Rachel got married. That was in 38, I think, or 39. I think 39. And those were the tough times. What they called the dirty 30s. Have you heard of that?
I have heard of that. Can you tell me what it was like for you?
I have often mentioned I can't see how my parents could keep their sanity. You know, the bottom dropped out as far as prices were concerned from 29 on. Then to top it off, in the 30s, we didn't have a crop for 3 years. So we put out the seed in the spring. That was all under horsepower. And we usually had 20 horses or 21 or so. So did all that work and got nothing in return. That was bad. You could get about $3 for 10 gallons of cream. Wheat was about 28 cents a bushel, if you had any. Like oats, they probably didn't even buy it all the time, but if they did buy it, it's probably 7 cents a bushel, or a dozen eggs, probably 6 cents. But then we had chickens and some geese and ducks. And of course, the pork that was laid in the fall, probably butchered 6, 7 hawks at a time. And of course, that was out in the barn. And then, of course, you had to bring the meat after it was cut up into the kitchen, and then some of it was ground, made into sausage, and some left for hamburger. And you see, there was very little beef used because, see, a beef required more storage, and there was no cooling facilities. There was no refrigeration, no electricity. So that the hams and the sides, that was all cut up and put into a 55 wooden barrel. And and then you put a salt brine in there, a lot of salt, and you'd let it cure. I imagine at least 3 weeks, maybe a month, but I wouldn't be sure of that. And then it was smoked. And that would keep from, let's say that you butchered in November, that would keep until next summer, and that could be hanging out in a granary. It could be hot that it was dripping, and it would not spoil. So the Indians knew about that salt. You've probably read about them gathering salt by some salt lakes, and so they must have used it along that line. I've never, but they didn't have the pork, but they had the buffalo. Whether they would use it on, I don't think that would work on beef. See, and buffalo's similar to a beef cow or steer. See, pork is different. So maybe you couldn't use that brine on beef.
So, would you guys make sausage?
Yes.
Would you help with that?
Yeah. As I got older.
How did you guys do that?
Well, should I go way back to where you caught the pig, and they usually weigh 200 pounds, I think. It must have been around 200 pounds. And then you stuck them with a knife in the throat. And you try to hit the heart. See, they would die faster that way. And then you take the next one, and when you had them all stuck and dead, you'd start carrying them to the barn. Then you had some sawhorses and set up, and whether it was a door and other lumber so that you could dress them on there. So you'd have to scald them. See, that was another thing. On the stall in the barn, you'd have a barrel stuck underneath the trough and had a rope on it to hold up the barrel, and you'd have to have the water heated in the kitchen in a tub, like a wash tub. They're oblong, and they would hold about 10 gallons, I think. Well, then you had to carry that water out as long as it was, well, while it was really hot. And then you would stick the hog in there. Now, I don't know which came first. I think they stuck the head in first. And turned them so that they would get the same amount of heat and water. But the back end was stuck out because they were so long, longer than the barrel. So we had to pull them back out. See, this barrel was sitting at an angle because you had to keep the water in there. See, and then be standing on top of the sawhorse or whatever, and pull the hog out and turn it around and put the bag end in again. So then leave them in there a while, not too long, and then take them out. Then there was usually neighbors came to farm to help with the butchering, and they'd start taking the bristles off. See, they weren't skinned. See, you treated them with this hot water so the bristles would get soft. See, and then you'd have a sharp knife. Well, everybody, the knives had to be sharp. And so I got in on that a little bit, but but you had to know better than what I had to do. But so then after you had the bristles off, then you'd hang them up to the rafters, head down and the back feet up. Okay, then they'd start out cutting off the head on the bottom and put the head away. Of course, whatever meat there was, that was safe too. That had to be saved for sausage or whatever. And then you'd open the chest from top to bottom and take out the intestines and the stomach and the heart, well, everything. You took everything out, and then there was the carcass left there, the ribs and the legs, and that was ready to be cut up into pieces. The side pork. You know, in the early days we didn't make bacon. See, that was the side pork. The ribs. See, that was put in with the brine too. And then Ma would cut reams off of there and fry it in the pan, and then it was something like ham or bacon. That's the word I want. It tasted a little bit like bacon, but now they have a better cure for the bacon, and but it was anyhow. It was good eating. And then the intestines had to be cleaned. That was usually Anton's job, as I remember. And he was pretty good at that. He'd have a board or a leaf from the table, something flat, and then you'd have a butcher, a butter knife or something like that. It wasn't sharp. Or take the back end, and you would get all the mess out of the intestines and wash them out, or you could turn them inside out too. See, so they were clean. And well, then later on, I can remember where they used to buy some intestines too. You could buy them in packages, and then you didn't have to clean as many intestines when you could just use those. See, they were sort of frozen, and well, then you'd have to thaw them out, and they were ready to go. See, there was a lot of work to that. And then you had to separate the fat, cut the fat up, and that had to be boiled for lard on the stove too. That all had to. And in I think the earlier days, yeah, we did have soft coal then already. But before, that had to be done with wood. You know, a wood and coal stove with all those. Well, there was a big top on there where they had different holes to put coal into, and you take the cover off and feed them from the top. Or there was an opening in the front too on the stove where you could put some coal in there. And that also had the oven, just like electric oven now with a stove, only the burners, see, that was all cast iron. But that had to warm the kitchen, and in the wintertime that used to be so cold in the kitchen when you got up in the morning that if there was water left in a pail, that was frozen solid. That's how cold it got. Well, there was no heat coming in there. And, then in the living room, we had a hard coal stove. You could feed it from the top. There were little chunks of hard coal. I think they came from the east. They don't have that kind of hard coal. And if you poured in a pail full of those hard coal on top, it would feed itself. They wouldn't go up in flame, but they just became red. And they heated the whole room all night, and if it wasn't too cold, it would last until the next night. And we had 2 rooms like that. The folks had another room, a big one, and a bedroom, and had another stove like that in there too. And you regulated with, there was a damper on the stovepipe, and then there was one for air on the lower part around where the ashes came out. See, if you'd open that and give it more oxygen, say, then it would flare up more and give you more heat. They were a good stove.
Where did you get your coal from?
From town.
How far was town from your farm?
11, well, you can say 11 miles, 10 miles south and not quite a mile east. It was always considered 11 miles to town.
When you would do the butchering, about how many hogs would you butcher at a time?
Oh, I think probably 6 or 7.
And would you butcher cows at the same time?
The what?
Would you butcher any cows at the
No.
same time?
No, because see, I mentioned with the beef, you had so much meat, and it wouldn't keep because there was no refrigeration. Where with the pork, that you would salt, and that would keep.
So with the 6 to 7 hogs, how long would it take you guys to butcher them and get the sausage all made up?
Oh, well, everything, that took a whole day. You started early in the morning, but by evening, I think you already had some sausage to eat. Well, and of course the grinding had to be done by hand. The grinder had to be hooked onto a bench, so that it wouldn't turn, and that took quite a bit of pressure, because that was raw meat going through there. And that was work.
What about butchering the chickens and ducks and stuff? Who was responsible for that?
Well, we never butchered that many at one time. See, there are two, you'd have to eat them right away because there's no refrigeration. So in the summertime, as soon as they got up to where you could butcher them, you could pick one out and catch it. Either way you could. Maybe you find some in the chicken coop yet. And we had a pretty good dog for that too. And there were a whole bunch of chickens around, probably 100 of them at a time. And you could pick out the chicken that you wanted, and that dog would catch that chicken among all the others. But the dog didn't live that long. But otherwise, sometimes you'd have to chase it. Well, there was more than one of the kids to run after him, but it was better if you didn't have to chase him. Of course, then you'd have to cut the head off and bleed him, and oh, they'd be jumping around for quite a while with the head cut off.
You said you'd have to bleed them. What do you mean by
Well, the blood would come out because you cut the head off. See, then so they were the blood was drained by the time they quit jumping around. But they were really jumping for a while. But it was just the nerves. I don't know what kept them going. And
Would you ever have to help with plucking the feathers or anything like that?
a little. But the fine stuff, the girls had to do that, and then they had to be cinched too, what was left, little pieces with a paper or light a fire and hold them over there and turn them and get all the fine stuff off. And see, they had to be put in scalding water too, just like the hogs.
Did you ever go hunting when you were a kid?
Gophers.
Can you tell us
But
about that?
But the older boys, they did more hunting because that was their only money they ever got to speak of. Unless there was a dance, and they'd get $1 to go to the dance. And
Why would you hunt gophers?
gophers?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they were destructive. If they were close to a wheat field, they would go in the wheat field and cut down the ears, eat. And also, of course, they needed grass too. So and they dig holes, cover some more grass. So there was always some gophers.
How would you hunt for them?
How we'd hunt them?
Mm-hmm.
You could hunt them with a trap, and then you could snare them too with a twine. Have a loop on the front, and you could be 6 feet away from the hole while you would put that loop around the hole where the gopher would come out, because you'd see it go in there. Because when they'd see you come, they'd go into the hole. So then you put this loop around the hole, and you'd sit a little away so that they would come out, so you wouldn't scare them. And when they're out far enough that the head was out, and you saw the rope was around here, then you would chirk. See, and out came the gopher. Well, then all you had to do was turn him around and kill him. While the twine was still around the neck. And of course, in the 30s, they paid for sometimes 2 cents, or 1 cent a gopher tail, sometimes 2 cents. And then sometimes you'd put them on some thread or something and just catch the tail by the skin. And you could have a long rope with tails. And because I think the reason for it was if you'd put them in a can right away, they'd get smelly. So I think after they were dried, you could put them in a can. See, then you'd have to take them to the county auditor. And now, did they really count them? They probably did. And from there, I suppose they took them to the dump ground. Well,
so would you get to keep the money that you got from gopher tails?
Yes, which wasn't very much.
What would you spend your money on?
Well, if you had a chance to go to town, which wasn't very often, you'd probably buy some cookies or something to eat, or maybe ice cream cone, and because there was never that much money. See, the only way I used to get to town when I was, well, about everybody for the 4th of July celebration. That was always the day when the farmers went to town, when they'd have some parades and races and get your knees skinned because everybody fell down, or most of them, and it was all gravel, the streets, and the other times that where I got to town with when we had 2 loads of grain to haul, and Dad, he had the more spirited team on his wagon, and then I followed with a slower team, or gentle. And so, well, when I was 8, 9 years old, I think I drove that team to town already. And you'd get to town or around 11:30, start out at 7 at least, and 7 o'clock to 11 before, till you get to town. And there was hills too. See, and we lived in Hills District. That was named for the hills. And it was hilly. And those horses, they used to have to pull so heavy going up those hills. And because nothing was cut down, you know, just a trail to get to a county grade.
So did they have fireworks in town? And
No, they had firecrackers, but there wasn't much later years. But the city didn't put on any fireworks.
what type of activities did they have for the youth?
For the youth,
Yeah.
there was. Now, you have reference to the farm kids, or? Yeah, there wasn't anything, except when you got older, you could go to a dance, and that wasn't very often that there was a dance to go to. Then the community, St. Anthony's, they had a baseball team at one time, and that didn't last anymore. But there was nothing to do Sunday afternoon, so that was the recreation for those boys to get together and play ball. Probably gathered by St. Anthony's Church, and they'd get together, and sometimes they played the town team from Napoleon, and maybe Bernstead. There was a Bernstead too. It's all gone now, and Wishick. They used to have teams all around there. Linton. But there, see that transportation, you had to wait till you had cars. Before, there was always horses. I was the first one to be baptized, taken by car to the church. That was in 1921. Up to that time, it was all with the horses, winter and summer.
Do you remember what your parents' first car was?
What year it was?
What type of car?
Oh, Model T. With those canvas doors, or, well, the door was metal, but then on top, I think there's something like isinglass, whatever you could look out through, which usually cracked anyhow. See, it wasn't glass, it was some other material. And then the next model was a 26 Model T. And then when Anton got married, then they gave the model, yeah, that was the Model T, yeah, to Anton, and they bought a Pontiac, a 6-cylinder. And that was such a long brute. Yeah, that time they looked for where you could haul cream cans in a car. See, and in that Pontiac, you could get 3 cream cans in the back, behind the front seat in the back. So you can imagine how long that car was. And if you got into a muddy road with that thing slid around, you couldn't hold it straight. And we tipped it twice going down a hill. And just going slow. But it slid around and caught a little bit and was top heavy and tipped it. Remember one time, Dad and I and Rafel, he was the driver. They took me to town on a Monday morning to go to school, and because I was staying with my sister, and going down a hill, and there was some sleet, and sure enough, it happened to him too. But it happened to Alois before going down a hill. So Dad was in the back seat, Rafel and I in the front, and Dad behind with 2 cream cans of cream. And there, the thing was laying on its side. And so we had to climb up on top and open the door. And then Dad was in the inside. And, well, those cans were laying down too. Well, they had to set them up, and then we'd have to reach down and pick them up and bring them out of the top, through the top as the thing was laying down. And then Rafel had to run back. That was over a mile from my brother's place, because Alois was married then already, and had to come with a team of horses to set that thing up again. Yeah, and I don't think we spilled any cream. The cover was had wire on it, and on the cover, you could fasten them down.
So how often would you take cream to town?
Well, it depended on the season. See, in the summertime there was more cream. In the wintertime, it slowed up pretty much. But still, it helped a little bit as far as groceries were concerned.
Can you tell us about how you would make cream? What was that process?
Well, you would of course, you'd milk the cows, and you'd have a cream separator. And that you usually had in the house, because you didn't have room out in the barn, and this was warm anyhow in the house, and you had to have that cream separator bolted onto the floor, and you'd have to turn it by hand, and that took quite a bit of power to get it going. And there was a cylinder in there with what you call them, fins in there, a whole bunch of them stacked on top of each other. See, then when you had enough speed on it, you would open the tank. Then, but you kept on turning, and the milk would go down into to this cylinder, and that was really speeding by that time, very fast. See, and the milk went through, there was an opening on top, but you had to screw this cylinder down with those fins in there. And with that speed, that would separate the cream from the milk. Then you had two spouts. One is where the cream came out and one where the milk came out. So now the cream, that was the smallest part. There was not much cream with the milk. So that didn't take a big container. But then you'd have a pail sitting down for the milk, and then you'd have to put another one there. But this one took, maybe sometimes you probably got a gallon of cream out of the whole milking.
How often did you milk cows?
How often? Every morning, every night.
And how many cows did you guys have?
I think must have been around 29 maybe. I don't think we had many more than 29 in the summertime. But that didn't take too long with all those kids there to milk. And you started out pretty young. As soon as, I think when you're 6, 7 years old. Well, then you'd get the easier cows to milk, because some were hard milking. There's a big difference.
So what type of farmers were your parents?
Oh, grain and cattle.
Can you tell me what a typical year involved in the farming world when you were growing up? Like, what would they do in January? And then take me through each month.
Well, I think by that time you were waiting for spring. Because there was, you had to feed the cows, and if there was pasture enough, you didn't have all the horses in at one time, and you kept maybe a working team and then 2 ponies, and but then towards spring, I think in February already, we would bring in all the horses in the barn, so they would get grain and hay to prepare them for spring's work. But not all farmers did that. See, if you didn't grain those horses and get them in shape, and you'd go out there and start plowing, well, they'd play out on you the first day. And we never had any of them do that, because, we always had a supply of hay, even in the 30s. But that would be another story, why my dad homesteaded there in 1900. He came in 1897 in January, and he worked up around Fessenden for a farmer by Pat O'Neill. I think he was up there 3 summers and 2 winters. And this Mrs. Pat O'Neill, she taught him how to, talk English and read and write. That was pretty good of the old lady. I think they didn't have any children. And, but his uncle and cousins, they lived south of Kintyre. That would have been about maybe 10 miles. And Dad heard of this Campbell Ranch at Kintyre. See, there was no Kintyre at that time. They called it Campbelltown, because he was just a rancher there. So, but he heard that there was better pay there than what he was getting. And so he moved down and he started working there. That was in '99 in the fall. And I think, see, being that Dad had learned how to talk English and he could write. See, and Campbell, came from Scotland, and they were big ranchers. So in short time, he made him foreman of the group that they had there. I don't know, did they have 6 men working all year round, or there were mostly some German guys too, would come up there and look for work. See, and then in 1902, Campbell gave him the checkbook and some cash to go and buy cattle, go down as far as Hague, because the reason for it was they had a lot of hay and it was an open winter. You know what I mean by open winter? Where we didn't have snow to speak of and it wasn't cold. See, so he could see that they'd have a lot of hay left over. That's why he sent them. So he took the bobsled, and that was just with the front runners. See, a big sled would have runners on the back and the front, and you'd have a grain box on there. But if they just used the front, they would build a little box on there, and you just had the front end to contend with. And that was just fine. Easier for the horses. Well, anyhow, he was gone 2 or 3 days. And he came back, and he had bought about 90 head of cattle. See, when they came up from Eureka, South Dakota, I think I mentioned it, that's as far as the railroad went. So those homesteaders, or younger guys yet, they came up from the south and worked their way to Zeeland, Hague, and then finally to Napoleon. After that was settled pretty well. Some started going to Rugby, some went to Canada. But that's why these people already had some cattle down there at that time, where you could buy some. And Campbell knew that. That's why he said he can go as far as Hague. And there was quite a few miles down there. Well, when he came back, he took 2 of the boys that were working there. By that time, he had his brother come over, and he was working there at the ranch too. He was younger than my dad. And another rider. And they went down and picked up those cattle and brought them back to Kintyre. Well, then the old man, Campbell, he walked around and looked at him, and he'd ask him, how much did you pay for this one? And, well, Dad would tell him, yeah, I think you paid a little too much for that one. Well, how much for this one? And, well, he gave him another price, and, well, you got a good deal on that one. So he was satisfied with the purchase that he made. But, see, considering when you stop to think what Dad came with not knowing any English, not knowing how to write. But see, by 1902, then he must have learned that yet by Mrs. O'Neill, how to write checks. See, he couldn't have used the other boys for that, because all they knew was German. And well, I didn't know any German when I started school, because it was all German. And those kids, I guess they were really punished sometimes for talking German in school. They weren't supposed to. And well, I think I knew yes and no, and I don't know whether I knew my birthday, but But that's how they all started. Just think. If you think back, to start out in a one-room school with that many kids, and they all had big families. See, the schools were located so that the furthest, I guess, was about 2 miles from the school. But there were so many neighbors, and they all had children. That's what brought up that total. See, then later on, well, then the older ones weren't in school anymore. Some had moved away, and because they just had small farms, most of them, and they'd probably find a better place. But anyhow, I don't know. Didn't they have as many children anymore then? The next generation, probably. But there's a Schwarzenberger family. They had 14. They lived about 2 miles west of our place, and a little south. And well, I think we're pretty much in the average with 10.
Okay, let's talk about some head cheese.
Yes. Well, you know, there's nothing wasted. Everything, just about everything was used. Now, head cheese consisted mostly of the skin of the pig. You see, you've probably never seen the skin of a pig, how thick it is. See, that's pretty thick. See, and that was ground up. I think first they would have to heat it, I think in water. And then it was ground up. And then, of course, you'd add salt and pepper. And I don't know whether they used anything else. And you used the pig stomach. I suppose you've never seen a pig stomach, have you? Well, the thing is about that big. Okay, now, so that stomach was cleaned out well too, and then one end was tied shut. You see, because the stomach has an opening and also an outlet. So you tie the end shut so that when you put in this head cheese, that it wouldn't come out on the other end. And you would use the same sausage stuffer. This sausage stuffer you could put in, we had one that you could put in at least, I think, 2 gallons of meat. And there was a press on there and a gear on top. Then you turn the handle, and as you push that whole plate down, and then there was a spout extending right above the table if you had it on the table. And that's where you would hold that stomach over this outlet. And then you'd pump it full of this head cheese. So they had some other little stuff in there. I don't know exactly what it was that what they added yet. I think some kind of meat yet, so it wasn't just all of the skin. I don't know what you call it, hide or skin. See, that was tough stuff. They even made gloves out of those pig skins, but it wasn't really a skin. It was heavier, and you made the sausage the same way with this sausage stuffer. That there was a spout on there about this long. Then you would put the intestine that you had cleaned, shove it onto this spout, and then you'd go along with you'd get the feel of it, how tight it is, because if you didn't move it away in time, then you'd bust the intestine. So you had to get the feel of it and just let it go as you. Usually the same guy would probably turn as was putting his hand down here to get the feel of it. And but if it was a different guy, you had to watch it pretty close. See, and when the intestine broke, well then you would lose some meat. Of course, then you'd pick it up and put it back on top again and use it again. But then you'd probably have to cut the intestine off too and tie it. So it was best if you, well, the best would have been if they'd have bought intestines instead of, but that was cheaper that way when you made your own, even though that was all cheap stuff. But if I could tell you how hard times were, you couldn't believe it. You know, when you have a bunch of kids and no crop and no work to speak of, well then that's where some of the boys went to the CCC camp. Then they could keep, I think, $5 a month, and the rest went home to the parents. $20, whatever they got. See, and that's the only thing that we could have got as a helping hand, or whatever you'd want to call it. See, there was no WPA for us because we were too rich. See, we were considered rich. And I'll tell you how rich we were. In 36 and 37, Dad couldn't even pay the taxes on the land. We had 8 quarters of land, and a quarter of land taxes was about $17 or $18. And there wasn't even money to pay the taxes. See, that's where so many of them lost the land, and they left. They left with families, with the car, and just what they could take along. Just imagine leaving the farm and going west, or some went to Michigan, and to pick up jobs. But see, Dad had a little more pride than most of them. I don't want to brag about it, but it's the truth. He tried to be self-sustaining instead of waiting for a handout. So he didn't have the cattle mortgaged, and he didn't have the land mortgaged. And if you didn't, then you couldn't work on WPA or anything like that. See, so we were left out because we were too rich. But I just mentioned to you how rich we were when he couldn't pay the taxes. And I think he had made arrangements with the county commissioners that they carried him for 2 years. And then the crop started coming back in 38, and he could pick up again on the taxes. But see, now can you imagine, he homesteaded there in 1900, well, he got married in 1904, and then working that land and whatever comes up in farming, say all your life until, say, 1937 or 38, and I'll lose the whole thing. See how those people must have, you know, we as kids didn't realize how much pressure those people must have had. Yeah, there's any number of them that left. Yeah, a dad bought our neighbor's farm to the south, and they moved across the river to Solon, and they started up over there. They only had 2 quarters of land here, so Dad bought it, and that's where Anton moved after he was married. And but like Mathers, they must have had 10 or 11 children too, and that's how they left. With well, they got some money out of the land. I guess he didn't have too big a mortgage on it. But with 2 quarters, and I don't remember how much Dad paid for a quarter, or for an acre. See, a quarter is 160 acres. And I wonder if he paid more than $20 or $25, but I just don't know. See, I was so young yet too, and there's many things I should have asked later on. But I used to have Dad along on the mail route. See, I carried mail for 30 years in Napoleon. And so, see, and he was one of the first settlers around there. But he was so sorry that he didn't pick up different land. But his cousin, Andrew, he lived 2 miles west of our place, but he used to come out and cut hay in that slough. And, well, now Dad didn't know anything except ranching, because he came here when he was 18 years old. And they operated different in Russia than here. And this Andrew had been here since 1896. So he knew more already about hay and so on. But, so he told Dad, if you want to go into ranching, homestead down there, and you'll always have hay. Now this was true. We always had hay. Not an abundant amount in the 30s, because not much grew at that time. But this was the only good feature there was out of those hills that Dad homesteaded in. From the north end, oh yeah, and he told Dad he should homestead 1/4 of a mile wide and a mile long. Then you get that whole hay slough. See, and that was level. So if you looked from our farm to the south, you could see a whole mile down. See, and that's where we'd have hay. We always had at least a year's supply left over for the next year. See, which most people around there didn't, because they didn't have a slough like that. But then the rest of it, see, but I can't blame my Dad, but he was sorry later on too. But he said I could have homesteaded any place from Kintyre all the way down to St. Anthony's. See, that was probably 20 miles and nice land. And I went down in those hills. And during the 30s, we had sandstorm day after day, no rain, I used to be out herding cattle further east of our place. And when I saw a sandstorm come, I'd get the cattle home. And sometimes you wondered that the buildings didn't blow away. And that was day after day, just about every day, wind and no rain. See, so there was hardly, that's why you had to get the cattle out to a different place so they could eat some more, because the pasture was so run down. So you couldn't keep that many cattle. And there weren't any cattle buyers around anymore either, like there used to be in the early days. They used to come around, they'd buy cattle or horses or whatever, and that all went down. Bernstead, that was C.P. Bernstead started up the town of Bernstead. I think about 1905 or 6. And he had a whole bunch of horses and mules. And he had quite a bit of land east of pasture at Bernstead. And he used to build up some county roads, and I think he worked some roads for the state. I think they used to have 17 team of mules, if I'm right, on that mocker. Now, you don't know what I mean by a mocker. See, that was a big machine, a heavy machine. And it had a sort of a disc cutter out on the side. And there was a man that could operate as to how far this, you could let this disc go up or down. See, and that picked up the dirt as they went along a straight line, and then that would elevate it up, and sometimes they used a team of horses with a dump truck to haul that dirt to a lower spot. And that was awful hard work for those horses, because everything was soft and the dirt was heavy. See, that's how they build road. They call it a mucker, because it picked up that soil and elevated it up and into that wagon box. But it was shaped like a wagon box, but it had an opener on the bottom, that when they got to the place to dump it, they were called dump wagons. I remember one yet, that one was standing around someplace. But so he used to, the C.P. Bernstead, he used to ship soybeans, I think it was, in by the carload to feed those animals. And then he used to put on rodeos with Pat Bernstead. He was a pretty good cowboy. Yeah, that's where we got to go to once in a while too, when they'd put on a rodeo.
Can you describe what the country roads looked like when you were a kid?
Just a trail.
How would you travel in the wintertime?
With a sled. Yeah, the car wasn't used in the wintertime because you couldn't get out because of the hills. See, the low spots would fill up with snow, and there was always so cold, and snow. See, the weather was a lot colder than it is now.
You talked about the cattle in the sandstorms and having to move them for feeding. Where would they get water from?
Well, we had a well at home, a windmill and a tank, a 10-foot diameter water tank. See, and there was always enough wind for water, because the windmill now that well was 160 feet deep. And that water was so good, just like almost like rainwater. And if they didn't go that deep around there, then it was rusty. And but if you went down to that 160 feet, then you had good water.
You mentioned that your family got some assistance from the CCCs.
No, we didn't.
Oh, no, nobody went to the CCCs?
No. They could have sent one. Well, they asked Rayful whether he would, because he was that age, whether he'd want to go. And of course, Ray was the bashful type anyhow, and he said he didn't. And Dad never pushed it either, because Dad was so homesick in Russia. His dad died when he was 10 years old, and his mother died when he was 13. So then he stayed with uncles. And they used to beat him up too, because he was so homesick and he'd holler for his ma. And one of them said, "I'll give you ma," and he didn't give him a licking yet on top of it. So I guess he never forgot that. And he knew what it was to be homesick. Well, I was homesick and I stayed with my sister in town. See, our school closed up. There was only 2 of us left. See, like I said, the population went down so much. So they closed the school, and I was supposed to go on horseback. Would have been 2.5 miles at least to the east, through the hills to the next school. And Dad didn't want that. Well, send a 13, 14-year-old kid. Yeah, and you didn't know what kind of weather you'd have in the evening when you'd leave in the morning. Probably come up with a heck of a storm. And so Dad, well, I'll go back a little further. My sister and her husband, they lived on the farm a mile west of our place, and they moved to town. But they didn't move in until October 1st. And so Dad wanted to send me to town school, but being my sister hadn't moved to town, I would have had to board someplace, and I would never have stayed, because I got homesick staying with my sister. So it had to do with politics too, I guess. See, the district could have paid tuition in town. Well, that wasn't so much in those days. But, that one said, that would be fun for that kid to ride that distance, to the school and home in the evening, start out early in the morning again to be there by 9 o'clock and so on until 4. Well, then Dad, he paid the tuition in town. But the bad part was, like I said, my sister didn't move to town until October 1st. And here I come, a dumb country kid, to the schoolhouse where there was I think close to 30 students in that one room in the 8th grade. And I didn't know a soul. I didn't know anybody in town. None of the kids had never seen him before, and was a month behind. So you can imagine the circumstance that I was up against to start school. I came with my 6-inch shoes, came up my farm shoes, And so I had never seen a basketball. So if we used to have maybe 15 minutes or half an hour some days to go for physical ed, but I couldn't because I didn't have the right shoes. So out there I could be sitting on the sideline again, and if there was any choosing to do, where you chose sides, well, there I was the last one to be chosen again, because they all knew that I was dumb and didn't know anything. And at noon, he started a service station. Then I had to stay at the service station while he went to eat. And then I'd eat first, and then he would go, and I'd have to stay at the service station. And then run back to make it in time because I had an hour off. And the same thing in the evening again. And then I was supposed to study, and was it a wonder that I got homesick? I had never been away from home, even though it was my sister. And I couldn't wait until Friday night when they'd pick me up, or I'd catch a ride with somebody to go home. But in the wintertime, I couldn't go home because the roads were blocked. So I had to stay longer. And then in 1938, my sister was 32 years old. That was Margaret. She died. Had 3 children. Then I had to feed the kids yet, and her husband. Of course, all he did when he came home was cry. And he hardly ate anything. And you can imagine what I fixed. So I couldn't wait until, see, that was around the 30th of March, I think, that she died. Well, then, after school let out, see, then I got out of there. I could stay home. Well, then, sometimes my mom would go up and help, or one of the girls would help. Well, it was a rough situation. But, you know, those are the circumstances I grew up with. Boy, oh boy, But anyhow, when I got my first report card, see, every 6 weeks you got a report card. And after, the way they did there was they had their studies for a month, and then they reviewed for 2 weeks for the test. Well, then when my report card came, I had all F's except one subject, and that was our state subject that I was teaching at that time. The rest were all F's. And I was just hoping that I could make up time to graduate, because I was so sick of school and homesick, and then I had to work all the time yet. And so when I made it, I graduated from the 8th grade. And that next year, they wanted me to go to high school, and I just wouldn't go. I just wouldn't go. But Dad, again, he didn't say anything, because he knew that I was homesick before. But then I spent that year at home, and of course doing the help with the chores. And then next year, there were more that started going to high school. See, around our area, nobody went to high school yet. Now further north, my wife's brother, he had gone to high school. He was older. Well, then my wife was of high school age. And then there was a Schwarzenberger, there was a Bitz, and so on down the line. Heard that all of those guys, neighbors, were going to go to high school. And I almost waited to the last day, and I told the folks, I'll go. So I had been out of school for a year, but I was sort of in line with the rest of them as far as age was concerned. And that's where, well, I knew my wife a little bit before, but we were in the same grade then in high school. See, and that's the one I got married to.
You mentioned that you graduated 8th grade. How did you end up making up your Fs so that you could graduate?
How
did you make up for the Fs
well,
so that you could graduate?
Well, I did better every month. See, and then you had to write the exam at the end. See, I didn't have to write state exam. The teacher made up the exam as far as I can remember. See, in country school, you had to write state exam. But in town, I think the teachers made up the exam. They probably felt sorry for me too.
So when you started high school, did you feel more comfortable at that point?
Oh yeah. Well, I was older then too, and then I knew people. See, I knew all those that I had in the 8th grade. Well, they were sophomores then, and of course I had got to know a few of those that were freshmen, and then there was quite a few farmers started, but not too many stayed. They quit after a while.
How did your sister die, Margaret?
She had many headaches. And whether she had heart trouble, I don't know. But see, we came home from school because the two oldest children, they were in school, and then she had dinner prepared, and she had washed that morning, but she had gone to bed. So kids and we ate, and when it was time for, well, by that time it was time for school, I went in to see her. I asked how she was doing. Well, I think it's getting better now, she said. And about an hour later, she was married to Tony Mitchell, and Louis Mitchell was the janitor. He came into the room and told me that Margaret died. Just that quick. Now, I don't know. Did she have a heart attack? But, see, the younger boy, Tony, he was 4 years old. She had sent him to the garage, because at that time he had a garage, her husband, to tell him to come home. Now, I don't know, did she tell him that she was dying, or did she just tell the boy to call his dad home, that he's supposed to come home? And when he got close to the house, it was only 1 block from that he had to go. She was standing under the door, and when he got there, she said, "I'm dying, and I'm glad to die," and took care of the children. passed out.
You said she was married to Tony Mitchell.
Pardon?
Her husband's name was Tony Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
Did he ever remarry?
Yeah.
When you were growing up, you've talked about the dirty 30s. Did you ever see any? I've heard about grasshoppers being a problem. Did you guys have a problem with grasshoppers?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Whatever there was left, the grasshoppers came along and ate it up. And on top of that, I know one year we had worms yet. They were about this long and, the size of my little finger. And what the grasshoppers had left, they cleaned up yet. Those grasshoppers were so hungry that they chewed on the siding on the barn or on the house along the edge. If you had a fork outside of the barn, and when you used it the next day or so, you could feel the roughness on the handle where the grasshoppers would try to chew in there, and that the handle was rough. After you worked with it a while, it wore off again. But that's how hungry the grasshoppers were. And you could see it on the siding, where they overlap, and then they went along the ridge and chewed on there.
Did you guys do anything to try to protect the barns or the house from the grasshoppers? Was there a way to stop them?
Oh no, there was no chance. But they did, must have shipped in some, looked like sawdust. And then you could go to town, and there was a place where you could mix it with poison and take a two-wheel trailer behind the car, and it would take a load home. And then my dad and another guy would sit in the back of the wagon, and one would drive the team, the horses, along the low spots. And one had a little scoop on this side, and one the other, and they would throw some out, and the other one on the other side. And, that would kill, but that was for the birds. How many grasshoppers could you kill when you had that many acres of land? And not everybody did it either. Well, some had some bricks fixed up too that you could pull with a car, with Model A, but that was too hard on the car and to drive in the plowed field.
So when you were growing up, what type of farm equipment did you have on your farm?
Farm implements?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was plows. We had 3 plows. Each had 2 bottoms, and 5 horses on each plow. And then one of the boys would come along with the seed drill. There was 4 horses on that, and that was 10 feet wide. See, all that land had to be plowed. Well, they used to have some rye that you would seed in the fall, and that grew earlier. Sometimes it grew enough so that you could have the cattle on there for a little while, and it would stool out again and produce rye if the weather was okay. But the price was just no good for it at all. And see, it's looked something like wheat, but you've heard of rye bread already, but it doesn't taste good. And there was very little use for that anyhow. And the price, I think, was probably down to maybe almost nothing then. And then we had a header. You don't know what a header is like because it's hard to explain to, but I have a picture of a header that I can show you later on.
That'd be great.
And we had such hilly land that we used 6 horses on the header, and but many of the farmers just used 4 horses on the header and 2 on the box. See, that elevated the grain up to a header box, and in the middle of the field you would unload it and mix stacks. And then during thrashing season, they'd come along and move the thrashing machine in between, and then you would throw in from both sides, and the grain would come out on the other end of the thrasher, and that you hauled home to the granary, or hauled some of it to town right away.
So did you guys have a threshing machine?
No. My brother later on, brother-in-law, but Dad never was, well, he was not so mechanically inclined. Maybe that's why. But he knew of some too that had those thrashing machines and they couldn't pay for them, and they lost them anyhow. Because, see, you have to get help to haul bundles. And at that time there were stacks yet too. And but first they got the bundles first. And then came along the second time for the stacks. See, those stacks were, from here to that wall there, that long. And probably from that wall to here, wide. See, then you'd put a top on it. As you go up, so the rain would run off of there. See, and there was very little spoilage. Even if it rained on there, it would sort of dry out, and, well, sometimes if it rained too much, then it would start germinating along the top. So you'd have a little loss there, but not that much. But that was hard work for the horses too. And pitching, see, then you had to unload everything by fork. And then you had one on the stacking it, and one unloading. And usually my job was to drive the team. And then I'd climb up on the end of the elevator, and the next team would come along, and then I'd jump back into the box again and drive this team. See, so I was busy all day driving teams, because I was too small yet to do other work, but I was big enough to drive the team.
How long would you be out working during threshing season?
Threshing season, I think they usually started around 7. Maybe before my days, they probably started earlier yet, because I think there were some steamers that they had to get going earlier, so somebody had to go out there to get the fire going. But in my time, it was gasoline tractors already. But then you'd go until it got sort of, not exactly dark, but pretty near.
So did you have a tractor on your farm when you were growing up?
Not until 1935. See, because of the the hay supply got less, so we sold more horses, and then bought a used tractor, which was no good, from Bismarck, because they didn't have enough tractors to go around, because everybody wanted a used tractor. They didn't have money for a new one. And some turned out pretty good, but ours wasn't. I think my dad looked at, it had those metal grippers on the see, the wheel itself comes out smooth, and then you would bull these locks, that's what they call them, on there. One here and there and so on, all the way around, see, to give it grip. And I think Dad looked at those grips on there. They looked good to him. So he figured that that tractor hadn't been used much. But it was just the opposite. It had a flat crankshaft on there. And then every once in a while he had to have a mechanic out there, and then he got rid of it, got another one. That was a good one then, but...
Do you know what type of tractor the first one was?
International, a 1530.
And do you know when he got rid of that one?
I think the first one we must have got rid of maybe the next year.
And when did he get a new one? Did he get it at the same time?
No, he got one from town. Did they give him anything for the old one? But anyhow, that one was okay. And
Is it the same type, an International?
yeah, it was the same type. And it pulled a 3-bottom outfit. But then my brother got married in 1940, the one next to me, and he still had that tractor on the farm. And he took it to Wishick to have larger pistons put in. And then it had the power of a 2236. Then he could pull a 4-bottom plow and a press drill behind it. So then one time over, you didn't have to come along with the horses again and seed it.
So did the tractor change the way you guys farmed a lot?
The tractors?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. From 1940, 41 on. See, then they came out with the rubber tires. See, there's very seldom that you saw a rubber tire. And of course, nobody would believe it, that they had more traction than those logs that they had. It's surprising, but you see, those logs, they would spin easy, and with the rubber, there was more setting or crawling along as there was with this iron stuff. I don't know how to explain it, but anyhow, there was more traction with rubber tires than with the iron logs that they had on there.
What's your dad's name?
My dad's name was Rafel, and one of the brothers was named Rafel.
And do you know how he met your mother?
Yeah. That would be quite a story, too. See, my dad was 18 when he came in 1897, in January. And my mother came in 99, I think, or 94. No, 98 or... See, when my dad came, the railroad only went as far as Eureka, South Dakota. And that's where all these German Russians got off and started moving north. And my mother came, she got off at Wishick. So, and I think the railroad came through there in 98 or 99, if I'm right. And she was 16 years old, came all by herself from Russia. And I think she had an uncle over here that picked her up from but the first night she spent in the depot there at Wishick, all alone, I think the lady there, depot agent, brought her a piece of bread. And, you know, she couldn't talk a word English, nothing. Well, then she began working for different farmers. And sometimes you had to work outside or inside, but mostly outside work. Now, I mentioned this about Dad buying cattle. That was in 1902. Then by that time, while he was buying cattle, there was another guy that went with him. He said, if you want me to, I'll go with you. I know where the farmers live. And he said, sure, that's okay. I'll take you along. And so he was buying those cattle. And then it was on a Sunday. They went to a church at Strasbourg. See, because they were Catholic. And my mother at that time worked for Bernhard Strassmeyer, a priest. She didn't work for him long, but he used to go across the river to the Indians and try to teach them, and I suppose he probably had Mass over there too at times. And as they drove from Strasbourg east of the church, I think the church was out in the country at a little distance from Strasbourg. And there was two girls walking there. They were pretty close to the church, that farm. There was a Schweitzer, my mother's cousin. So they knew each other from Russia yet. So here there was two girls walking, and they stopped with the sled, whether they want to ride along. They said, no, we're just about home already. And one of them was my mom. And this other guy with him, he said to Dad, that's a nice girl, when they left, you know. And that was all. Later on, he came down to, his sister had come over too later on. She was married to a Jacob Kunz. And how he knew that she was there, he must have found out a little bit something, because he happened to get there at that right time, that Sunday. She came with the priest to I don't know. No, I think she was on vacation. She had time off. And he got down to her sister's place, who was married to a Jacob Kunz. And their grandfather was there too, I guess. And he said that old man, he was pretty smart. He said he could read, and that was out of the ordinary for those old guys to be able to read. And then he gave Dad a book to read. And so Dad started reading, and here he noticed that Mom was standing behind him and looking in the book too, but she didn't know how to read. And now I don't know, was she touching him or not? But I think he probably felt he had something going here. And then see, Ma couldn't write, but he could write. And there was a wall boy that would write letters for my mother. And so whenever he knew that she was coming to that area again, then he'd either go horseback or with a buggy from Kintyre down there to see her again. And then he wasn't going to get married yet. See, he was first going to build a house, at least a one room. And that would have been in 1904. They had planned on getting married in the spring. And then there was a Keller woman. She knew that my dad had a heel cut off in the thrashing machine in Russia. You see, there's a cylinder that knocks out the grain out of the bundles. But in Russia, they had to throw the bundles up on top, and somebody else had to put it down on that cylinder. See, and that was going at a high speed. Of course, it was horse-driven, but there was gears and all that connected up with it. And so he climbed up on the thrashing machine, and he saw there was a little wheat or something laying there yet, or straw, and he reached down to push it down. Now, didn't he see that cylinder was probably still going pretty fast? See, if it was going fast, you probably couldn't see it at all. And that cut off his heel from the back to about here. See, and there was just a flap hanging here. Well, then they had to take him from Mannheim to Odessa to a doctor. So the doctor sewed it on, but some of it stayed, but some didn't. So there was just a skin over the back part of his heel. So the pressure was more on here than on back here. See, then he walked with a slight limp. Well, now this Keller woman, she knew about his heel. And she wanted her brother to get married to my mom. When Dad's uncle's wife found out about that, oh yeah, this Keller woman, she had told Ma, do you want to get married to that cripple, that has no heel? And I guess Ma, well, I didn't know for sure. And when his uncle's wife found out that there was something going on, that he throwing sort of a monkey wrench into that marriage. And this was in January. And she got after Dad. She said, you go and get married now. And I'll even put on a wedding for you. Yeah, and so Dad took her up on it. So he borrowed a team of horses from his cousin, because he was on the home place yet by his uncle. And the priest was in at St. John's, that's around Zealand, a little north of Zealand. There was a country church called the St. John's, and that's 22 miles to St. Anthony's. So if they wanted a priest, one of the farmers would have to get him and take him back the next day. 22 miles one way. Well, now Dad's uncle, they were about almost 10 miles, say 8 miles for sure, north of St. Anthony's Church. See, they had a little church there at that time already. And so he went with that team, drove down to St. John's. Mom wasn't along, and he told the priest of their intentions to get married, and I suppose told the names. From there he drove to Hague, that's with the same team of horses in one day, over to Hague, and there he stayed overnight with his uncle. I had another uncle there by that time. The next day he went to Strasbourg, bought a suit of clothes, and picked up Ma by the priest and took her to, her parents had come over here by that time already to, this was about 2.5 miles or so southeast of St. Michael's. So they still have a church there now. And that's where her parents lived. That's where he dropped her off. And, or did he stay there overnight too? And come the next day up to Aunt's place, and there's some of her daughters-in-law came, and they sewed a dress for Mom, for a wedding dress. And Dad drove to Wishick and picked up some beer, and I don't know whether he had some schnapps too. I don't know if they had schnapps in those days. And I suppose they, in a day or two, I suppose they were married. And old Anton Wangler, he had a button accordion, and he played for had a dance yet. So I knew that old Anton Wangler yet. He must have brought that button accordion along from Russia. And he was married to Dad's first cousin. See, then they stayed a few days with Uncle and Aunt, and then they moved down to Andrew Gross, the one that recommended that Slough Hay quarter, and they stayed there until spring. And then they got Andrew Mathern, he was a carpenter, and he got him and along, and they built a one-room house on the homestead. Oh, they moved in there, and it wasn't too long after that. Here comes Dougal Campbell with the buggy, I think it was. And he asked Dad, he said, you know, I want to go back to Scotland, and I'll be gone a long time. I want you to come up and take over the ranch again. Yeah, Dad said, yeah, how can I? Got married now, and we're expecting a baby. Of course, that was natural, huh? And he said, that's all right. He said, I'll build you a 2-room house up there. And you take over, and I'll send Eddie down. He said, that was his brother had come over. And with a hay rack, and you load your belongings, and so he took him up on it. See, now there I could have easily asked him what he as far as finance was concerned, what he paid him. But I know he got along well with Campbell, because I know he had shares on sheep. He must have had 200 or 300 head of sheep when he started, and they were all from Campbell on shares. See, and that's how he started with cattle. See, and he wasn't going to, I guess, break up the soil so much. Maybe the better areas, but then neighbors came in from the east, and they started tearing up the sod right away. Well, then he had to do that too. So some of those hills and rocks should never have been cultivated. See, that's where all that sand came from too. Of course, that wasn't just our place. You go all the way down to Texas, not Texas, but Kansas. If you've read anything about dust storms, I think they were worse down there yet than here. That's how bad it was. See, then after they started breaking up, and he started breaking up soil too. Well, there was this tall grass and rocks. Now I start out. I think Ma used to walk ahead for the first round or so with a hand plow. And see, after you had a furrow, then one horse would go along in the furrow, and you would get along by yourself. But to start out, having the reins around your shoulders and holding that sulky, well, it wouldn't be a sulky, but a one bottom, and then you hit a rock, and oh, that must have been miserable. But I think he didn't use a hand plow very long. He got himself a sulky, I think, because of his leg too, that he didn't have to walk so much. But he had that limp, a little limp all the time, and I think he tried to hide it, but you could see it anyhow. See, this part of the heel came up, and this part went down, because the pressure was on here. Because I'm back here, that was too sensitive to. Yeah, Ma said it was a long time before he ever showed her this foot.